Okay, so I'm patting that dry with a paper towel just so that I can move on. I'm working on some Bristol vellum, mixed media paper, which is a really smooth paper, and it's easy to paint on. It doesn't warp or buckle, so it's a nice piece of paper that I like to do some practice painting on before I work on canvas. So I'm going to use some limited colors here of some blue and some burnt sienna, white. Those are the colors that I'm going to use here. Maybe a little yellow ochre as I move along in the painting. And I'm going to start with some wide brushes. Just some cheap brushes. You can get these 3 in a pack, Michael's, Hobby Lobby. So I'm just putting some paint down, covering up some of the marks that I made, leaving some of them there. Just really don't have any thought in mind. Just seeing what will happen, just experimenting, moving the paint around with this color chaper. I like to use those a lot. It's a wooden handle with a silicone wedge attached to it, and I mix paint with it. I put the paint on canvas or paper along with it also. I'm muting some of the colors. I'm putting some of the colors on a little more full strength and overlapping those colors as one color dries. Putting it on pretty fast. It's just a process of kind of experimenting, adding, limiting the colors, adding some light color, mixing the colors together so I have some muted neutral colors, and go back in and make some marks. Some of the paint is wet, and I probably shouldn't put the marks into the wet paint, but just trying to experiment here and see what will happen. So I continue to do this, and I'll stop narrating this for a while. So sometimes then I will look and say, well, there's some areas that need to be darker. What can I do? So I think I've also have some raw umber that I'm mixing in to this blue color that I'm using. Create some of those browns in the darker areas. I like to start with a thin layer of paint with a wash, a thinner layer, and then develop some thicker paint on top of that. And I don't want to get too thick in the very beginning, because the thicker the paint is, the longer it will take to dry, and it's going to be more difficult to build up layers. So if I start thinner, I can build up layers as I go. Okay, so now I've decided to add some burnt sienna, which is a warmer color of complement to the blue. Blue and orange opposite each other on the color wheel, so that's why I'm using that color. I really like to have complements of colors and like to be able to mix those complements together to be able to create some neutrals. That's how you get the neutrals, is by mixing two complements together. So I think that was a really good color to add. So I'm putting that on with brush, color shaper, and scraping through to get some other textures and line. And I also mixed some yellow ochre, which is creating a nice green. So it's a variation on the blue. I really like the colors in this piece a lot, and it did turn out pretty well. So I like to have a variety of different marks when I'm painting. That's how pastel has really helped me to develop different ways to make marks. So I want some of those wide areas of color. I want the marks from the brush going in different directions. I want some smaller marks, maybe some straight, jagged marks with the brush, some longer lines with the brush, and that makes the surface of the paint more interesting when you have the brush strokes going different directions, when you have different sizes of brush strokes, different types. You've got some scraping. It just makes that surface much more interesting than having it all be the same brush, the same direction, the same size of brush stroke, the same thickness of paint. So what I'm using here is another tool that I've had for a while. It's a lot like the color shaper, but it's got teeth like a comb at the end, so it can put in some of the different kinds of marks and textures. So it's a fun kind of a tool to use that I don't use very often, but I like the effect here in putting in some, really pure blue and going back in and creating some textures. It's a fun tool to have that I really like. You can look around the house. You can find different tools that you may already have that you could apply paint with, just to experiment, like maybe an old card, like an old expired credit card, a sponge, paint rollers, trowel, all sorts of things that you could find in your house that you could use to see, well, what would it be like if I applied some paint with this? It doesn't always have to be a brush. Okay, so this is it for this one.